Somewhere, right now, a baby is having the most intense experience of its life. It is seeing colors for what feels like the first time, hearing a voice that makes everything feel safe, feeling the warmth of someone who loves it completely, experiencing pure, unfiltered, overwhelming wonder. Every single second is new. Every single second is extraordinary, and not one second of it will ever be remembered. Think about that for a moment. The most emotionally rich period of your entire life. The time when everything was discovery. When the world was impossibly large and impossibly beautiful. When you were loved in a way that was completely unconditional, is simply gone. You were there. You experienced all of it, and you remember none of it. Why? This question, which sounds simple on the surface, turns out to be one of the deepest mysteries in all of neuroscience. And the answer, when scientists finally began to piece it together, revealed something extraordinary about what memory actually is, and what it requires, that most of us never think to question. Let's start with what most people assume. Most people assume that baby memories fade the way old memories do, that they were stored somewhere, and then, over time, the filing cabinet got full, or the files got corrupted, or something simply erased them, as if forgetting were just a passive process. Things you once knew, slowly leaking away. But this is not what happens. And the difference between what most people assume and what actually occurs is one of the most fascinating things the brain does. The real answer begins with a structure deep inside the brain called the hippocampus. Your hippocampus is the primary architect of long-term memory. It is the part of your brain that takes experiences and converts them into something storable, something retrievable, something you can access years later when someone asks what you did last summer. Without a functioning hippocampus, new long-term memories cannot form. You can still experience things. You can still feel emotions. You can still learn certain kinds of skills. But the narrative memory, the story of what happened to you, where you were, who you were with, that requires the hippocampus. And in a baby, the hippocampus is not finished yet. At birth, the human hippocampus is present, but profoundly underdeveloped. It is generating new neurons at an extraordinary rate, a process called neurogenesis. But here is the critical detail. The very process that is building the hippocampus is also destroying the memories being formed within it. New neurons integrate into existing circuits, and as they do, they disrupt the patterns that encoded earlier experiences. Imagine trying to write a story on a page that someone is simultaneously editing. Every sentence you write, they are rewriting. Every paragraph you complete, they are reorganizing. The story never settles into a fixed form, because the page itself is still being written. This process, the destruction of early memories by the very neurogenesis that builds the brain, is called infantile amnesia. And it was first described properly by the psychologist Sigmund Freud in 1899, though Freud believed it was caused by psychological repression. The suppression of memories too emotionally intense or inappropriate for the conscious mind. The real explanation, as neuroscience would eventually discover, has nothing to do with repression and everything to do with construction. But neurogenesis is only one part of the story, because even if a baby's hippocampus were fully developed, even if the structural machinery for long-term memory were in place, there is a second problem, an even more fundamental one. Memory, real retrievable memory, does not just require a place to store experiences. It requires a framework into which experiences can be organized. It requires language, not necessarily spoken language, but the conceptual architecture that language provides, the ability to say, this happened before that, this person was there, this is what it felt like, this is where I was. Without that framework, Experiences can be felt, but they cannot be stored as narratives. They cannot be retrieved as stories. They exist only in the present moment, and then they dissolve. A baby does not yet have language, not in the sense required for episodic memory, and so even the experiences that the developing hippocampus might retain have nowhere to go, no structure to hold them, no label that allows retrieval. They are like photographs with no filing system, taken and immediately lost in an unorganized pile that can never be searched. Researcher Patricia Bauer at Emory University has spent decades studying the emergence of childhood memory, and what she found was that children begin to retain accessible autobiographical memories, memories they can later describe and retrieve, at around 2 to 2.5 years of age. Not coincidentally, this is also around the time that language acquisition reaches a critical threshold, when children begin to use narrative structure in their speech, when they start saying things like, "First we did this, then that happened, and then." The memory system and the language system are not separate. They develop together, and they require each other. But there is a third dimension to this story, one that is perhaps the most philosophically striking. Because even if a baby had a mature hippocampus, and even if it had sufficient language, there is still something missing. Something so fundamental that we rarely think to name it. A sense of self, memory, the kind of memory that persists, that we can retrieve, that matters to us, is deeply tied to the concept of the person who had the experience. When you remember something, you don't just remember an event. You remember that you were there. You remember it as something that happened to you, to this specific continuous self that has existed across time. A baby does not yet have that sense of self, the concept of I, the understanding that there is a continuous being called me, who persists through time, who will be there tomorrow to retrieve today's memories, emerges gradually between 18 months and 3 years of age. Before that emergence, there is no one to remember, not in the way that remembering requires. The baby is experiencing fully, completely, but there is not yet a me that is having experiences. There is only experience itself, raw, unattributed, beautiful, and gone. Now here is where the science takes an unexpected turn, because researchers have discovered that while explicit memories, the kind we can consciously recall and describe, are almost entirely inaccessible from infancy, implicit memories, the kind stored in different brain systems entirely, survive completely. Your earliest relationships are stored implicitly. The emotional tone of your primary caregivers, whether the world was experienced as safe or unpredictable, whether touch was associated with comfort or discomfort, whether crying was met with response or silence, none of this is accessible as memory in the narrative sense. You cannot remember being held by your mother. You cannot remember the specific moments when you learned whether the world was trustworthy. But your nervous system remembers. In the way that the body remembers things the mind never recorded, psychologist Daniel Stern spent decades studying infant development, and his conclusion was that the emotional patterns formed in the first years of life create what he called a core sense of self, a pre-verbal felt experience of who one is in relation to others. That shapes every subsequent relationship, every subsequent sense of safety or danger, every subsequent experience of being loved or not being loved, not because you remember specific events, but because your nervous system was shaped by them in ways that persist long after the events themselves are gone. So here is the strange truth that neuroscience has arrived at. You do not remember being a baby, but being a baby made you who you are. Everything you experienced, every moment of love, every experience of safety or fear, every relationship that formed around you before you could form words, shaped the architecture of a brain that would go on to have every memory you do have access to. The blank in your earliest memories is not emptiness, it is foundation. The part of you that was built before you were there to watch it being built. And perhaps that is a strange kind of comfort, that the things you cannot remember may be the things that shaped you most. Because the brain that is reading these words right now, the one that finds certain voices comforting, that trusts some people more easily than others, that feels safe in some environments and uneasy in others, was shaped in those unremembered years by experiences you will never access, but that live in you still, in the only way they can, as the invisible architecture of everything you are. If this made you think about your own earliest years differently, share it with someone who has ever asked the same question, and I will see you in the next one.